So many of you are joining us. We're very excited, as always, to have our host for the evening, who will be Ed Stourton, and a very distinguished panel to talk about what we think is going to be the way it's spoken is Fiducia Supplicans. I'm sure I've got that wrong. But anyway, I'm Amanda. I'm the CEO of the Tablet. I'm going to hand over to someone that's a bit more of an expert on it. Over to you, Ed. I hope you enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I think it's fiducia, but then I'm bound to get it wrong in the course of the evening too. All good wishes for Valentine's Day, and as Amanda said, Ash Wednesday at the same time, and welcome to the discussion of Fiducia Supplicans, the Vatican Declaration, which allows the blessing of couples in what are called irregular situations, and critically, of course, of same-sex couples. My day job, or at least my very early morning job at weekends, is presenting the Sunday programme on Radio 4. And the other day we did an item on the 1,500th anniversary of the death of St. Bridget, one of the patron saints of Ireland. And our expert, who was surprisingly radical, I was taken by surprise anyway, Irish historian, told the story of St. Bridget giving away her father's sword to a poor man so he could sell it for food. And she then added the thought that historically the churches have found it much easier to bless weapons like the sword and armies and wars than to bless love, which is a striking thought and perhaps pertinent to our discussion this evening, because whatever you think of this document, I think it's clear that it's had a pretty difficult birth. It isn't very often that a piece of very serious Vatican teaching is rejected by all the Catholics in a continent in the way that the African bishops have rejected Fiducia Supplicans. It is a difficult time, I think, in many ways. It's been a difficult birth. It's really a relatively short document, just 10 pages on the Vatican website, but it's clearly enormously consequential, and in the view of many people will have an influence on the way the church deals not just with the matters which are the focus of the document, but with much bigger questions about church authority, about the way the church makes up its mind about questions like this. We got three people, as Amanda mentioned, with us who I hope, and I think almost certainly will disagree to some level, but who are all supremely well qualified to talk about this subject. I've asked each of them to prepare just a couple of minutes to kick us off, to give us a sense of where they stand, both on the document itself and indeed on what's unfolded since it was published just before Christmas. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order of their surnames, just to make sure there's no question of me preferring one over another. So first, here's Mark Dowd, former Dominican friar, documentary maker and married to Stephen with 3 adopted boys since 2018. And he's the author of Queer and Catholic. And Mark, I should, in the interest of disclosure, admit that we've talked about this before on the air, and you are a big fan of this document. Tell us why.
At the age of 15, I fell very deeply in love with a boy at school called Paul. It was a very holy and sacred experience for me because I wrote poetry. I would have walked to the ends of the earth for anything that Paul wanted if he'd been in danger. And it brought home to me something very, very radical, that although I was being taught by lots of people around me and perhaps the school and the teaching authority of the church that somebody like me was, to quote the teaching, intrinsically disordered, here was the most incredibly self-affirming and beautiful experience. When I married Stephen in 2018, I had a very similar feeling of being blessed, and that the love that we share and continue to share with the adopted boys that we have is something ultimately rooted in God, because there can't be any love that isn't rooted in the sense of the Creator. In Galatians, we talk about in Christ there's no Jew and Greek, and there's no free man and slave, and there's no male and female. I'd like to think if we updated that, it would also not make distinctions on grounds of sexual orientation, because Christ's incarnation into the world has transcended all of those divisions. And therefore, at one level, I believe in equality, and this document should be disappointing to me, because I think that I believe in a church that would marry me in a church with Stephen and make it a full sacrament. So I could complain that the bottle is half empty, and it's a disappointment, and it's discriminating, and it's a terrible injustice. But we gay men and lesbians and bisexuals and other people that don't belong to the heteronormative paradigm have learned one thing, which is patience. We're part of an emerging tradition. We're more visible than we were 30 or 40 years ago. And I think fidelity to this document and welcoming it is part of my witness and testimony to being a good Catholic, and to continue to make the case that our love is no better and no worse, but equal in the eyes of God. And so I do welcome this document.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for being, like a good broadcaster that you are, so strict with the time. We'll move on next to Miriam Duignan, Executive Director of the Wijngaards Institute for Catholic Research, which, and these are her words, provides scholarly evidence to address complex and contested theological issues impacting the Catholic Church, which this certainly is. And I think your institute has just produced a book which is relevant, really, called Christ's Idea of Authority in the Church. Miriam.
Yes.
Yes, advertise the book, quite right.
Oh, you know.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, reaction to this new document, I have good news and bad news. So, on the positive side, I think it is a validation that's long been missing. It's very surprising. Honestly, never expected this to happen. So it constitutes a correction to what was said in 2021, which was Pope Francis said you cannot bless sin. Blessings of same-sex unions and those who were divorced and then remarried, it was banned. So now it is it's a real change. We will have people now who can openly and publicly declare their love. And what I hope and suspect is that Pope Francis's strategy is that people will see things and the practice will start happening before the actual official teaching and the doctrine can change. So essentially what will happen now that we'll see these blessings is that it will broaden and expand people's imagination, and that lays the groundwork for everyone to get used to it. And that's how change happens, from the ground up, rather than a dramatic change in official teaching. However, the bad news is the document itself and all of the arguments around it, it's still reinforcing an incorrect official church teaching that is still causing shame and pain. Essentially, when you read the details of the document, it's saying that the blessing is, it's really tantamount to saying best wishes to the individuals who make up the so-called irregular couples. But at the same time, we are supposed to be praying for God to help those two people to go back to the right path. That's what the details are saying. And according to current papal teaching, the right path essentially is praying for the dissolution of that conjugal union. You know, the priest will say, bless you and wish you all the best, but also implicitly suggesting that you should stop existing as a couple. Because you are considered irregular. And so for me, it seems a little bit schizophrenic. And the opposition to it, I think, is because you can see either side. You can see the positive, you can see the negative. Anyone can read into it really what they want. And the reason it's so schizophrenic, the core problem is that the Vatican is attempting to change the pastoral practice and what we see symbolically, which is very important and will make change, but they're not modifying the underlying outdated and frankly theologically incorrect doctrine. And those are two papal teachings, one on sex, where it's only morally licit within a marriage between a man and a woman and open to procreation, and two on divorce, which is still absolutely forbidden. So second marriages are considered objectively wrong and people considered to be living in sin. So for me, good and bad news, but ultimately schizophrenic.
Okay, lots to talk about there. Finally on our panel, Julian Paparella, originally from Canada. He's a doctoral student in theology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family in Rome. lucky him in that sense at this time of the year. He's married to Marion and has collaborated with the Venerable English College in Rome, the General Secretariat of the Synod, and Salt and Light Media. Julian.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you, with Mark, with Miriam, and with everybody gathered here tonight. I think I would take, obviously, the three of us are going to come at this from different perspectives. In certain respects, I think we'll have a lot in common, maybe some slight nuances between us. Rather than saying the ways in which this might be a failed theology, I think I would say that it's a step in the right direction, even though it's quite a beleaguered step. And I think, to me, two fundamental things that it does right are it's starting to get the whole church on the right wavelength in terms of what Vatican II already said about God being in the life of every human person. And they're already, Gaudium et Spes, this is now 60 years ago, nearly, talking about how the Holy Spirit is in the life of every person of goodwill in a way that God alone knows, at work invisibly by grace. And now, secondly, what this is doing is actually getting the church's pastoral practice up to speed with that deep theological, anthropological conviction that we of a church have already had for the last 60 years. So it's actually saying God is in the life of every person, regardless of the kind of family situation, couple, certainly other various diverse situations that we can find ourselves in, whether we're a refugee, whatever faith might be our own. God is there. And the church needs to put herself at the service of God's relationship with these people, which is how I would see this attempt, this step in the right direction that is certainly imperfect, certainly, partial in many ways, limited in many ways, understood by many in many different directions. What I find unfortunate about the document is that I think the way that it couches that step in the right direction isn't nearly solid enough. The title is On the Pastoral Meaning of Blessings. And so it tries to construct itself on what I would say is a kind of artificial distinction between pastoral blessings and liturgical blessings. What I think it kind of means is a difference between public blessings, as you would have at a mass, for example, in the sacrament of marriage, and private blessings, something that might happen sort of in the pews on the side after mass, in a sacristy, but also in a home when you get a house blessed. This, I find, is an unfortunate dichotomy. At the end of the document, it talks about the church as a sacrament of God's love. And in this sense, it's almost like saying, well, the church can be a sacrament of God's love pastorally, but not liturgically. So there, I think there's a lot more still to be unfolded, still to be unpacked, both in terms of how it's received in various ways throughout the world, but also in the church's own way of thinking about this and being able to articulate, hopefully, better and better as time goes on.
Well, let's just pick up, if I can, some of those thoughts with Miriam, because to some extent, what Julian's talking about touches on your point about contradictions. Do you think it's odd that the document spends quite a lot of time saying what it's not about, i.e. not about marriage, and it doesn't really give us, in practical terms, any guidance, or it didn't seem to me it did, on how you actually conduct a blessing of this kind? Is that a sort of, I mean, what's your feeling about that?
Well, I think what's been made very clear is these blessings have to be spontaneous and not planned, so that they don't resemble a traditional sacramental and officially approved wedding. But to me, that guideline that it must be spontaneous and just happen, during a mass, and go up to the priest and say, will you bless our union? No celebrating, no dressing up, even though, some people dress up for church every Sunday. So how are you going to differentiate? I just imagine the poor priests, having to turn people away and say, well, you're wearing a lovely dress, so go home and come back in overalls or something. And the fact that it's the guidelines and the clarifications have said, well, what we're really talking about is a 10 or 15 second thing. You know, it's almost like a drive-by. It reminds me of Las Vegas. You know, you go in your car and you drive through the chapel in Las Vegas, and Elvis is the presider, and it makes it feel like that, you know. So the fact that there are no guidelines kind of adds to the shame of it. You know, it's still saying, please don't think that you are sacramentally married or officially recognized by the church. We're just being kind and allowing you to have some sort of spontaneous blessing, and it's very intentional that there are no guidelines. The Vatican does not want there to be a liturgical rite around these new blessings, and actually the diocese in Belgium did create a rite immediately and have been criticized for it, because that's strictly forbidden, actually.
Well, let me ask Mark about this, because I think when we last spoke, Mark, you said you were actually planning to take advantage of this and have a blessing. How will you approach that? I mean, will you put on a morning coat, or will you be in your overalls, or?
Oh gosh, if only I had one.
Which, the overalls or the morning coat?
No, the morning coat. I think to be devil's advocate here, I hear what Miriam's saying. On the other hand, doesn't it give you a certain kind of latitude and flexibility that the thing isn't prescriptive? I mean, it doesn't give this birth to diversity and locality and spontaneity, and leaving it up to you and your partner and the priest to sort of devise whatever. I mean, I think what's slight, I mean, I've read in some commentaries that, oh, it's the sort of thing that might be done on a pilgrimage. So I have to persuade Stephen to come on the bus from the parish to Walsingham, tip off the priests before we go and say, by the way, after we've been to the Slipper Chapel, can we just have like 15, 20 seconds with you? And would you sort of say a few words, but we won't make a big deal about it. I'm sort of imagining that's possibly how it might be done. Now, Stephen's a very modest, not wanting to be center of attention, unlike me, kind of person. So that would suit him hugely. Of course, a big party and fanfare and music and ceremony and all that. I mean, for God's sake, we're Catholics. I mean, it's sort of against the DNA of our liturgical Catholicism to go all low church and almost disappear into the cracks in the church and hardly be noticed. But I think we've just got to be tentative, and this can change. It's the beginning of something, and we don't know where it's going. It's a bit like getting on that escalator at Holborn, the deepest escalator in the whole of the underground system, where you can't see the top, but you get on it in faith and confidence, but you're not quite sure where it's going to take you. That's where I kind of think that we're at, and I don't mind being in the mess. I do like messy church and confusion, because I'm a lead, kindly light, kind of ever-changing Newman sort of person, you know?
Well, before I go to Julian, I'll just say to all of you who've joined, we will take questions from you later on, so do fire them off in the direction, and Amanda will collect them all and pass them on to me. Julian, was that part of your point, that idea of it being a messy position?
It's messy, and I think there's two ways of seeing that mess. One is over time, as Mark is mentioning, us being on this escalator. I think in that regard, Newman is very enlightening. The development of Christian doctrine, and ultimately for the church, this is development at really neck-break speed. I mean, already Amoris Laetitia in 2016 was a huge step in the right direction. I think one way of reading this declaration is as being very much an expression of that. Amoris Laetitia that talks about the kind of path of discernment that has to happen between pastors and couples who find themselves in complex situations. But going back to what Miriam was saying, I think already there are better adjectives than irregular. That just seems like someone's abnormal as opposed to just being in a particular situation. I also think that a level of the complexity is not only this development over time, almost sort of organically progressing its way through the development of the church's teaching, but also sort of across the world. The fact that there's such cultural diversity here, and in both the case, I would say, of divorced and remarried, but also of same-sex couples, there is huge diversity across the whole world, and thus across the whole Catholic Church, in terms of how all of this is experienced culturally, socially, legally, politically. So I would say one of the sort of positive signs of the way that this has all unfolded since it was first promulgated in December is that the Vatican has opened up for a slightly more decentralized, slightly more sort of case-by-case implementation. There was, of course, this declaration that sort of no bishop, no priest can say that this is heretical, but at the same time, it's not a sort of forced, everyone must do this in a uniform way, as has been the case with other liturgical reforms. We can think of everyone having to go back to Latin to retranslate into all these different languages. Here, it's not that. And I think that's respectful of the diversity of where the whole world is at, even if from our vantage point culturally, things may seem a bit out of whack or strange.
Well, just staying with you, because you're in Rome, we ought to talk about the reaction, particularly in Africa. What does the Vatican make of that? What's the gossip about that in the Vatican?
So I think a sort of an interpretive key is that we're right smack dab in the middle of a season of synodality. We're between these two assemblies, that the first of which happened in October 2023, the next of which is this coming October, which raises the question, why didn't the Pope wait for the end of this synod in order to have a more across-the-board consensus in terms of this kind of step forward, which is a very good question. But it also means that a lot of these key players have been around here very recently. So, for example, Cardinal Fridolin, who's the head of the whole, consortium of African bishops, he was just here in October. He was in touch with the Pope. He was meeting with the Pope. And what's been said is that they were in very close communication with the Pope personally to try and work out, okay, what's the sort of position that the African bishops can take vis-a-vis this document that makes them, in a certain sense, opt out, but doing so in fidelity to Rome and in communion with Rome. So I think what we're seeing here is an expression of what Pope Francis has been talking about right from the very beginning, which is not a sort of top-down Rome, locuta est kind of approach, but rather what is the most appropriate thing to do on the grassroots level, and a pastoral discernment on the level of bishops' conferences, on the level of dioceses, while at the same time not being in opposition to Rome. I think that's really key.
Well, Miriam, I saw you, I think, nodding there. Are you convinced by that, or do you think there is a danger of this putting a real strain on the church in terms of its unity?
Well, there has been a lot of talk about the African bishops' conferences rejecting this outright, but I think that this is giving the continent of Africa a bad reputation. It's not just them who have really been opposed to it. Let's just look here in Europe. The Dutch bishops' conferences rejected this new document and are refusing to bless homosexual couples. And I think that would be shocking to so many people, because we all think of the Netherlands as being such a progressive and open country. But the fact is that John Paul II put in some very arch-conservative bishops to the Netherlands, and that's why they rejected it, because they're clinging on to the past. Around the time of Vatican II, they were extremely liberal and reflected the culture of their own country. I am sure there are many, many priests in Africa who are horrified at not being able to join in with this progress and this development along the lines of justice and lack of judgment. And then, so you see the Dutch situation, and then just next door you have Belgium, where they have already written a rite of blessing for same-sex couples. So I really think that I don't think it's going to be a mirror of the Anglican situation, where there's been a big divide between the African bishops on women and homosexuality and the rest of the world. I think there's a lot of opposition to it in pockets all over the Catholic world, because it really depends on who those bishops are, when they were appointed, and what side of the camp. Unfortunately, the Catholic bishops and the Catholic world has become very divided into pro-Francis, pro-progress in whatever you know, even if it's small in my mind, and then anti-progress and phobic of progress. And so it's those camps, and it's not limited to Africa.
No, but I wondered about the point that the divisions that you talk about exist and are perhaps exacerbated by this is a problem. I mean, you could presumably see in the circumstances you described, people from Holland popping across to get blessed in Belgium. I mean, maybe that doesn't matter, but I mean,
I hope they do. The only way to solve this problem is for Catholic people, who vastly outnumber priests and bishops, to really make it known that they are not speaking on their behalf. You know, the sense of the faithful, the voice of Catholic people is not being reflected by their bishops. I think if you go into a church and say, what do you think about this? Your divorced friend who has remarried and you know, has refused a sacramental marriage, has refused a Catholic blessing, can now get one, they would welcome it. Imagine you go and say to a mother of 4 children, your 3 children who have had a church wedding, your 4th, who is gay, happens to be gay, can now get a blessing in a church. They would welcome it. And so people do need to give more feedback to their bishops and say, you are not speaking in my name, and put more pressure on them.
Well, I sometimes hear this compared to Humanae Vitae, the great and, you know, famous and notorious, depending on where you stand, declaration of Paul VI on the subject of birth control, which, if you look at it squarely, has led to a kind of accepted level of disobedience among Catholics, certainly all over the European churches and North America, with people, everybody knowing that, you know, that's not obeyed. Do you think that this could lead to something similar?
Well, I would certainly hope not. I think that the division there was between the kind of magisterium and the teaching authorities and then the laity. It wasn't a geographical division as such as the one that we're facing at the moment. But you see, on this subject, there's one thing that's really important to point out here. You know, there are 7 countries in the world in which you can be put to death for same-sex practice. And there are another 65 in which it is a crime. There's no way that gay men and lesbians in those countries are going to go to their bishops with a partner and ask for a blessing in a culture and a society where they could lose their lives or at least face 15, 20 years in prison. And of course, one of the great areas that people like myself have been urging on the Holy See is to be much more vocal in the whole campaign for decriminalization. It's the whole kind of very tricky subject between the law and morality and ethics. You can certainly have a situation where something is decriminalized. It doesn't mean necessarily approve of it, but you just don't think it's right that people should be put to death for loving another person. But back to your point about Humanae Vitae, I mean, we keep hearing this word schism on this. I thought schisms were reserved for huge questions of doctrine, like the Filioque Clause, 1054, rupture between Orthodox and Western Christianity. I mean, why is this subject, you know, which affects relatively small numbers of people in percentage terms, why is it such a kind of touchy hot potato? And the link with Humanae Vitae is this, I think. The document says we're not asking people to be morally perfect to bless them. You don't have to, we're not going to be asking them about, you know, sexual practice and what they get up to in the privacy of their own houses and so on. That's off the agenda. Great, that's very welcome. But the fact is, there's always been this very strange link between Humanae Vitae and homosexuality, because both of them are about the expression of sexual practice outside possibility of procreation. So the minute you allow the house of cards to tremble in one little part of the base, you, rather like one of those pullovers that starts kind of unraveling with all the wool, to mix my metaphors, you suddenly find that, you know, don't forget the church just says it's been teaching since 1930 on this whole question of birth control. You're into a whole question of the authority of the church. That's what's at stake here. And I think this is why, if you look at social media and the hugely impolite, angry, downright rude and uncharitable exchanges that have been on this subject, I think it touches a deeper nerve, which is really about the sense of of authority of the church itself. So, you know, little old me in my marriage here asking a priest to bless what we're on about. For some of these people, this is, oh my God, the whole edifice might come crippling, you know, but falling down if we're not careful. I think that's the connection.
Well, that's a broader subject which I'd actually like to develop in a moment or two. But Julian, can I just put to you two questions that have come in from our audience tonight, because they're, well, in a way, they tell the same story. One from Martin, who says, what this has done is to free clergy to preside at such events, whereas they've been mostly behind closed doors until now. Blessing of heterosexual second marriage couples, as well as those for same-sex couples during Mass, have been happening for years. And Evelyn says, my gay son and his husband were blessed by a Mother Superior, which was very moving. 90-year-old uncle had a Mass said for them, wishing them a long and happy marriage. Does it have to be a priest who blesses us? Secondly, the nuns did struggle to understand the morality of my son subsequently having 2 children by a surrogate, but that is perhaps for another seminar. Yes, that last bit probably is. But that sense, Julian, that quite a lot of things have been going on quietly in the church anyway. Do you think that was one of the factors that moved Francis to do this?
Yes, I think there's many elements there. One is that it's certainly a case of opening up a possibility that was in effect already happening in many different ways in a lot of places. We can think even of 100 years ago, how many marriages between people of different Christian denominations would happen in sacristies, for example, instead of in the main church, because that was seen as being taboo and, you know, scandalous and so on. And now, you know, an Anglican marrying a Catholic just seems like a beautiful, normal wedding. There's nothing to hide about that. So I do think that there's an element of embracing where society is moving, while at the same time doing so in a discerning way, in a way that doesn't change the fundamental doctrine, but does change our attitude, our posture, our way of welcoming people, accompanying people, blessing people. In this respect, I think it's also, and maybe this touches upon what we've already been mentioning regarding the Belgian bishops and the fact that their ritual that they had developed is not being accepted. I think writing a document about it is at once bringing something out into the open that's already happening, but it's also a way of trying to establish some kind of guideline about it, even if the guideline is that there is in fact no guideline. So it's a very sort of tenuous position. I do think it's a temporary position. To link it back with what we were just saying previously about heresies and so on, I think part of this boils down to, are we a church that puts itself in relationship with the world, with where people are at? Or are we kind of an anti-modernity church, as we were at the turn of the 20th century? And in many ways, I think rejection of Fiducia Supplicans, when it's not for cultural reasons, like we've said, in countries where homosexuality is illegal or even punishable by death, I think as Westerners, we have difficulty even comprehending how diametrically different the cultural lens for all these questions must be. But when it's coming from, let's say, bishops in the United States, this is clearly not just a cultural difference. This is something much deeper, an ecclesiological, theological difference. And there, I would say, this kind of abject face value rejection of Fiducia Supplicans is at its root rejection of Francis, which is at its root rejection of Vatican II, which therefore is a clinging more so to the previous vision of the church before Vatican II, which is we're against the world, we're sort of the, you know, harbingers of moral truth, and then everyone else just kind of has to listen to whatever we have to say, instead of us discerning together with people today where they're at and how we can move forward according to what God's asking of all of us.
Well, I suppose that to some extent takes us back to what Mark was talking about in terms of authority. Miriam, to what extent do you think that this is a kind of pivotal moment for the Francis pontificate? I mean, do you think we're going to look back on this moment and say that's when, you know, he either succeeded or failed in his ambitions?
It's definitely the first significant change that has come about. You know, when you look at the hot potato topics in the church, you've got women's ordination, you've got priestly celibacy, and you have blessing of same-sex marriages, and the ban on divorce, the ban on contraception, all of those discussions that are being had within. This is the first big change, I would say, that he's made. You know, Francis has opened up a lot of discussions, but the tangible changes have been few. So I do think it's the start of possibly other changes that he would like to make. And it certainly seems to have been his priority, or maybe testing the waters in terms of what else could be done, because this modus operandi of his is basically to change what people see and what is able to be done without actually addressing the theology underlying it. So the document, Fiducia Supplicans, is making it very clear we're not changing the concept of marriage. It's still the primacy of heterosexual marriage that leads to children and the traditional family, but we will allow this thing on the side, you know, to be simultaneously happening. So what he's doing is changing pastoral practice, but he isn't changing theology. And what Mark was mentioning, that sort of house of cards come crumbling down, is true, because the big fear is that once you start little by little making changes like this without having to address the theology that it actually is incorrect, and they don't want to go there because it would take years to study all of these teachings and undo them theologically and in canon law and in our doctrine. So the fear is, if he's going to start allowing things like same-sex blessings, divorced people to get blessings and get validation from the church, what's next? Could it be women deacons that aren't sacramentally ordained? You know, and I think that's a massive fear. Could it be allowing some priests to get married without changing the underlying theology and addressing the history and the tradition? So yes, I think it's to those who are very afraid of change and who want to cling on to the teaching we currently have for whatever reasons, I think that this is really a reason for them to fear what's coming next.
And Mark, presumably, I mean, forgive me if I'm putting words into your mouth, but presumably you would hope in the long term that this did lead to a change in the fundamental theology that Miriam is talking about.
Yes, because a wonderful little story just to illuminate, I hope, my question. All this has come about, I think, as a result of Pope Francis's encounters on the ground with individuals. This has not become about because of some road to Damascus conversion whereby he's been sitting in a library one day, opened up Aquinas and thought, you know, same-sex blessings are a great idea. No. I mean, this man was, you know, the provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina in his late 30s. What was his position then on gay men and lesbians and bisexual Catholics compared to now? He's been inundated with hundreds, if not thousands, of letters and case studies and you know, incarnational encounters with people on the ground. As he says in Evangelium Gaudium, you know, realities are so much more powerful than ideas. This is about the importance of not having a priori beautiful principles which end up categorizing people like myself as defective heterosexuals. It would be so nice if we had this wonderful model. Now you've all got to be forced into it because it fits beautifully. No, let's scrub all that. Let's look at the beautiful creative world that God has made in all its diversity and find out what goes on in this world. And that's where Francis is coming from. And I think so much of this is about encounter. The lovely Janine Gramick, you know, the wonderful nun who was investigated for decades by the Vatican because of her insouciance, going around telling everybody that they were loved and worshipped by God and adored and children of God and so on. And there was one encounter when Cardinal Ratzinger was investigating her at the time. They ended up sitting together on a plane flying from Rome to Munich. And after 15 minutes, she said, "You know who I am, don't you?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I know you." And she said, "Can I just ask you a question? Have you ever met any gay men or lesbians?" And he smiled and said, "Oh, yes." He said, 7 years ago, Pope John Paul and I were in Berlin on a big visit, and we saw lots of them on one of those dreadful parades going through the streets of Berlin. That was his, idea of encounter, looking at, near naked men parading on a pride march in Berlin. And of course, the irony is he's surrounded by dozens and dozens of gay men every day in the Vatican. But of course, there's a cognitive dissonance about the whole business.
Okay. Well, you've I think another 20 minutes, slightly less than that, left. So let me take some of your our audience's questions. One from Carol here. This is intriguing actually, what is the status of such blessings in canon law? What minimum condition are you doing what the church does the document promote? I don't know, Julian, could you answer that?
It's a very good question. It would require a much more study than
Another doctoral thesis from you.
maybe another doctoral thesis. My intuition would be that this is not so much a question of revising canon law, so much as I would frame it as a reconfiguring of the life of our Catholic communities. To me, I think even more than any, as we're talking about, desire to change doctrine, which this document certainly painstakingly emphasizes it does not do, or any desire to change theology. Again, I would see this more as unearthing the theology that we already have and putting it into practice, certainly the theology of Vatican II. I would see this as opening up horizons for reconfiguring what our Christian communities actually look like and how our Christian communities actually embrace all their members and no longer have some who are seen as sort of being on the sidelines or taboo, or, okay, well, Father so-and-so sort of lets them go into the communion line, but it's kind of all just hush hush and we can't say anything. And then when a new pastor comes, everything's thrown up in the air and we don't know how the new priest is going to react. And I think this makes it clear that everybody is welcome. Everybody, so to speak, is blessable. There is none of us merits God's blessing or the church's blessing. None of us are up to scratch, so to speak. We're all in need of God's help. And how can we start being a church that offers that help, that grace more freely, more generously to everybody? And that also recognizes, I hope this would be a fruit in the short term of this document, what a gift all people, regardless of their marriage situation, sexual orientation, that every person is a gift to the church who has charisms, who has something to contribute to the body of Christ. And so it's not just a question of, oh, maybe we'll bless you on the sidelines, but you are important here and we want to bless you. We want to be conduits, signs, instruments, ministers of God's blessing in your life, even if we're not at the point of actually opening up the sacrament of marriage to people who find themselves in those situations.
All right, now I've got a question, Miriam, directed specifically at you, and actually touches on something you were referring to a moment or two ago. It's from Jamie, and he says, as someone mentioned, this change came before the conclusion of the synod. Progress on gay issues seems to be moving relatively swiftly, while progress for women seems forever stalled. Why do you think that is? And do you think it's true? I would just add to that.
Well, as Mark said, there are very, very many gay men in the Vatican. And I think that Pope Francis ends up talking to a lot more gay couples who are saying, our love should be blessed. And he's much more aware of their existence in the real world. And I don't think that Pope Francis ever really sits down with a woman who says, I'm called to be a priest and I'm currently doing the work of a deacon or a priest and not recognized as such because I am a woman. And I do think that it's a matter of priorities. It could also be that the opposition to the question of admitting women to ministry is so extreme in his environment that he doesn't want to take it on. I think possibly of all of the topics that are contested in the church, this may be this blessing of irregular, his words, not mine, situations may have been deemed the easiest one to start with.
Right, right. Mark, you're nodding. Do you think that's a good analysis?
Yeah, I do. And I think also at the risk of causing a bit of unpopularity and being a bit un-PC here, there's a lot of misogyny amongst certain kinds of gay men and amongst certain kinds of gay clergy. Imagine that's a male-only world in which you have no need for the presence of women. It's a little kind of club and it's all quite very nice and it works all on our terms. Certainly, I've met dozens of people who would fit that description also in high Anglican circles. And I think it's a real concern for women because it's a huge obstacle in terms of making progress. Also to say, I think Miriam's absolutely right. If Francis has been won round by the sense of encounter and listening and the postbox, he's got to be prepared to be in those spaces and to be quiet and listen. And this is all anecdotal, but I just get the impression that he finds that much difficult at the level of women than he does with men. And I think that might be something to do with coming from the part of the world. I mean, we all know Latin America is really one of the most patriarchal and macho kind of parts of the planet. And as enlightened and as wonderful and as marvelous as he isn't perfect.
Right. I also think that Pope Francis sees the lack of blessing, the lack of sacramental recognition in a church of love as a true justice issue, and he doesn't see the silencing and sidelining of women and the denial of church tradition and true theology as a justice issue. I think he sees it as a feminist issue and not a justice issue, and that's the core of what we need to change his mind.
This question from Chris, and actually all three of you can answer it, or might like to have a go. He says, some argue that bishops don't have the authority to simply reject the new teaching outright and forbid their priests from blessing same-sex couples. So even in countries such as the Netherlands, pastoral practice on the ground will lead to change from the bottom up anyway. Do the panel agree? I don't know, Julian, what about the specific first point, that the authority is not there for them to do that?
Well, the distinction here is very clearly that the authority is not there for them to claim that what Rome is doing is heretical. But they are being given by Rome the authority to choose whether or not it's implemented. Now, a great question would be, how are they going to use their authority if they choose not to implement it, for example, in Africa, but priests are still doing it practically on the ground? That would be we don't know, I don't think, that's still unfolding. If I could just go back to the previous question, only because I think it's really a key one, and I would provide a slightly different interpretation than what Miriam and Mark were speaking about. I think, on the contrary, it's not so much that Pope Francis undervalues the question of women. I think it's that he's seeing that there is not the kind of consensus when it comes to same-sex issues as there is about women's issues. There's one theologian in the United States, Lisa Sol Cahill, who talks about the Pope's frustration with the fact that on the Synod on the Family, they were able to reach a kind of consensus when it came to journeying and accompanying divorced and remarried couples, but not same-sex couples. And even the Pope's language there, he says, I agree, when he speaks about what was decided in the case of divorced and remarried, but he simply said, the Synod said, when it came to same-sex. Likewise, in this most recent Synodal Assembly in October, the choice was made that it was so fraught and so volatile that the terminology LGBTQ wouldn't even appear in the document. So my interpretation would be that rather the Pope is seeing, after this month-long synod, Fiducia Supplicans comes less than 2 months later, that the church was not moving sufficiently in the direction that he would want it to take, not only in the case of this synod, but even previous synods. And therefore, he's taking the initiative and saying, we've got to move forward on this. Whereas I think what's happening is not that the women's issues are being put on the back burner. There's a beautiful chapter that I would really encourage you to look at, all of our audience here, in the synthesis report of the October Synodal Assembly about women in the church, talking about how women need to be better formed, need to also be involved in the formation of priests, need to be involved in leadership and decision-making in the church, how the theological question of the women's access to a diaconate needs to be seriously reviewed. I think he's seeing rather that the synod is treating these issues seriously, and that it was treating less seriously, or less at least coherently, the question of same-sex, and therefore he's moving on that because he's trusting that with women it's moving forward. Just to conclude, a great example of that is that the last 2 meetings this month and a few months ago of his council of 9 cardinals had presentations precisely on the role of women in the church. So this is a really key issue for the Pope. I think he's just seeing that the church is moving forward on it in a way that he wasn't satisfied that the church was moving forward when it came to same-sex couples.
That's a really interesting answer. Your interpretation is he's actually taken this on because he sees how difficult it is, and because he doesn't think there's movement on it.
Yes.
I don't know whether Mark or Miriam want to, just going back to that question about whether bishops, what sort of authority really bishops have to reject the document, whether either of you want to add anything on that?
Yes. Well, I just would like to respond to Julian's point, and I agree. I think it's a very interesting point, because as Mark was saying earlier, that concept of if you change one thing, it's all going to come undone, and basically what angers the objectors to this new document the most is that there are no preconditions on the couple to present themselves and say, I would like to have a blessing. So officially, according to church teaching, they're in a state of sin, but they still get a blessing. Whereas before, the practice of the church was to say, we accept you, who am I to judge? But you have to be celibate. So you would be accepted as unsinful if you were celibate in a second union, or if you're gay and not, in a sexual union. But now that's been taken away. So that primacy of celibacy and that feeling of, celibacy is the higher state of being is now being knocked down by saying that same-sex unions and conjugal unions of those in irregular situations are worthy of blessing. And so I agree with you. It may be that was just one step too far and elicited so much fear in people, especially those who really want to consider themselves elevated and superior because they are celibate, all-male hierarchy.
Mark, any thoughts on that? Or have we lost him? I think. Oh. Mark seems to have disappeared. I don't know whether that's right, but let's keep going with Miriam and Julian. Question from Nicholas. Actually, this is interesting. I don't know the answer to it at all. Do any of the speakers know how Fiducia Supplicans is being received by bishops in predominantly Muslim countries? Julian, any thoughts on that?
It's a great question. Obviously there are some countries in Northern Africa which would be predominantly Muslim. So in that sense, the response of the African bishops would count for them as well. I haven't actually seen places like Pakistan. I don't know, Miriam, if you have.
Yes, I haven't. Yeah, thanks, Julian. I've only seen a reaction from Cardinal Romero, who's in Morocco, and his was actually, again, a little bit schizophrenic. He's being very open and saying nice things, but then reaffirming the fact that marriage, the Christian doctrine on marriage and sexuality does not change, and this document is reaffirming it. And so he refers to something along the lines of those who live at a distance from the Christian ideal and want to come closer to that ideal. So it's couched in very nice, pastorally sensitive terms, but he is ultimately reiterating the fact that you are being blessed, the people are being blessed, but your situation isn't. You still remain in a state of sin. So that's come from Morocco, although he did say that maybe the blessings aren't the problem, but homophobia and moral rigidity still nestling in the hearts of some Christians is still the problem. So
yeah, well, I mean, Mark, you're back, I think. I can't see you on my screen, but I believe you are. This is an interesting question, but you're there. Brilliant. Yeah. You popped up. Because it does raise a question. We've been talking almost entirely about what this does internally in the church, but it does raise a question of what it means for Catholicism's relationships with other Christian faiths and indeed with other faiths.
Well, the politics of all this, I can only imagine if you're in Nigeria or Africa where we're having the battle for souls and, you know, there are people allegedly converting to Islam from Christianity, probably the last thing you want as an African bishop is somebody running around the streets of Lagos with a copy of Fiducia Supplicans saying, isn't this all marvelous news? Because it's going to be a gift to those people who are trying to recruit souls in the north of the country. This is the nightmare, of course, about, you know, sitting on the throne of Peter, but having to deal with this whole kind of global picture. If I just may make one point, Ed, it's not directly related to this, but it's to bring back something to the United States, which is very important, where Francis has a huge number of opponents in the higher rankings of bishops in there. What we've seen in the USA over the past 20 or 30 years have been some scandalously unjust stories where couples, often great servants to their parishes and churches, have been under the radar, not declaring their love, pretending that they live at different addresses. One of them's been the organist, one has then been doing the administrating and all the rest of it. And then these people have had the temerity to suddenly engage in a civil partnership. And at this point, they've been sacked. They've been sacked from schools, they've been sacked from positions in churches. And this has given rise to scandal amongst parishioners because they see their bishops and priests behaving in an incredibly unjust way. This document is a huge bonus for such people because they can absolutely say, look, you know, my partner and I are blessed by God and by the church, and this whole process of discriminating and sacking people in positions of Catholic employment has just got to stop. This is not happening in Africa. It's not happening in the Philippines. It's been happening in the United States. And it's not just been happening at a level of one or two cases. There have been absolutely, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people who've been treated in this way. And it's been a very, very underreported phenomenon.
Well, you brought us right back to the heart of the discussion, which is appropriate because, rather annoyingly, looking at my timer here, we've run out of that wonderful commodity. Thank you all so much. It was absolutely fascinating stuff, and I feel I've learnt a lot. So thank you. And before we go, Amanda is going to just say a word or two to round things off. Amanda.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight to see all of you and to work with you again, Ed, on one of our live webinars. So thank you very much for that. Thank you to all our guests, Miriam, Julian, and to Mark. Again, it's been just wonderful exploring these conversations and just trying to delve a bit deeper into what the tablet's covering on a weekly basis. If you'd like the recording of Fiducia Supplicans, I think I at least learned how to say that this evening, then please do drop us a line and Stephanie will send you the recording through WeTransfer. Just looking at what's coming up, we've got the Tablet Lenten Reflection series of webinars. We've really gone to town on this year, so we're looking at 3 of the 7 sacraments: sacrament of marriage, sacrament of the Holy Order, and sacrament of the sick. This has been pulled together with the deputy editor of the Tablet, Maggie Ferguson. So I hope you'll join us for that series of 3 webinars which cover 3 of the 7 sacraments. They start on the 6th of March and run through to the 20th of March. We've also got the International Women's Day webinar on how inspiring women have helped change the world. And we've managed to get Sheila Fogarty to go on the other side of the mic and talk to us about her, what's inspired her and who's inspired her throughout her lifetime. We've also got Imelda Poole and Sister Linda Dearlove. So we'll be absolutely delighted to see as many of you on that one as we can. And we're also got our tablet webinar book club. So we're on retreat with Pope Francis by Austin Ivory. If you'd like to join the book club, all of the details of how to join and what you get are on the tablet website. We've got a whole load of new holidays, pilgrimages. These are, just to let you know, pilgrimages that are put together for tablet readers. So they're not off the shelves. They are actually tailor-made for tablet readers. So we've got Rome and Assisi, we've got the Jewels of Lake Maggiore, we've got a retreat to Turkey, and we've got a retreat to Iona. And then we've got an Advent retreat that we're just pulling together now. If you're not a subscriber to the tablet or the pastoral review, you can find out all the details of how to subscribe at www.thetablet. And if you're not a subscriber, we've got a lovely offer, 5 issues for just £5, and you get a free copy of Questioning God by Timothy Radcliffe, or With God You Are Never Alone by Pope Benedict. All the details of how to subscribe, 5 for £5, are on the tablet website. Easter is coming up as well. We've got Lent, but then Easter. We've got, if you want to give a copy of the tablet, it's a free gift copy, then please have a look at our special introductory price subscription from only £32. That's a quarterly subscription. And if you don't want to do any of that, but you would like to help the tablet and other people get copies of the tablet, we have a waiting list in schools and in prisons for subscriptions to the tablet. Again, all the details can be found on our website. Many thanks again to Ed and to Julian and Miriam and Mark. It's been an absolute joy. I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening if you're doing Valentine's or celebrating with us for the Ashes. So without further ado, good night to all of you. Thank you for joining us.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Bye.